it's lovely to see you all. It really, really is. And I'm absolutely certain you'll enjoy what you're going to hear. And the person who is going to take the major role today is James Bruce, who I think not only a member of the History Society, but is also a member of the Civic Society.
Should be.
But obviously this shared function happens every year, and we take it all 10 years. And it was the task of the History Society to organise it, to find the speaker, and that wasn't at all difficult. So, ladies and gentlemen, James Bruce.
Could you have some of those lights down, please? That's perfect. Yeah, great, thank you. So, good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. Am I audible? I hope so. Okay, I'm going to apologise in advance if we go into a couple of minutes beyond an hour. It might do, I'm afraid, but hopefully not more than that. The title is Berwick, Russia and the Crimean War, The True Story. And what you have here is a cartoon, obviously a somewhat propagandistic or even jingoistic representation of the 19th century rivalry between Britain and Russia. And it says underneath Afghanistan, in case that's not legible to you. Afghanistan, and then no you don't, the British lion obviously rebuking this drooling Russian bear. Now the thing is, put it to hand, what happened was, I'd just like to say a few words about how I came to be giving this talk. Bernard and Margaret Shaw had taken upon themselves responsibility for finding a speaker for this date, but their first choice had decided it wasn't going to work for them. So the thing is, this was my ticket for a match at the World Cup, which I got in February. So I knew I was going to be going to Russia this summer, and Spain versus Morocco. So the World Cup was in Russia, and to those that dislike football, my thoughts are with you at this difficult time. This was Gary Lineker tweet, but actually I can assure you this won't be all or even very much about football. But knowing that I was due to visit Russia this summer, I thought I'd offer to give this talk, and Bernard took me up on it. So, this is a statue of Alexander III. He was the grandson of Nicholas I, who entangled Russia in the Crimean War. The Crimean War, in which Russia was defeated by France, Britain, and Sardinia, who joined the Ottoman Empire to put an end to Russian expansion. And this quote is quite helpful, not least in explaining why Russia was defeated in the Crimean War. So Russia has only two allies, her army and her fleet. But never mind about Russia's allies, what about her enemies, and specifically what about Berwick? This is a representative sample of internet articles about Berwick and its war with Russia. One of them I have here. Berwick likes to joke that it is still at war with Russia, a legacy of the fact that it was mentioned in the declaration of the Crimean War, but not the subsequent armistice. Another one we have. Due to a legal technicality, the tiny village of Berwick-upon-Tweed, I'm not sure if people are fond of that description, has been at war with Russia for the past 160 years. As this didn't escalate into open conflict during the Cold War, it's unlikely to do so now. So, it also says here, when Queen Victoria made her official declaration of war against Russia in 1853, she signed herself as Victoria, Queen of Great Britain, Ireland, Berwick-upon-Tweed, and all the British dominions. And when the Treaty of Paris ended the Crimean War 3 years later, England's northernmost town was not mentioned, leaving it in a standoff with a nation whose population of 142 million people would have a slight edge in any clash with Berwick's dauntless 12,000. But the thing is, as I'm sure some of you know, for one thing, the Wales and Berwick Act of 1746 means that all of this is actually fake news, all of it. The Wales and Berwick Act means that any mention of England includes Berwick and includes Wales. And that legislation was in force at the time, so there isn't actually any question that Berwick was left in a state of war with Russia. And in fact, this is underlined by other things. So, but this was a particularly good article that came out. This was in February 2015. Berwick-upon-Tweed, the British town at war with Russia. Town, I prefer definitely town rather than tiny village. And did an administrative oversight really mean that a bucolic English town ended up at war with Russia? And what Nina Strochlik, if that's her name, how you pronounce her name, what she provided was actually links to these two things. So the declaration of war, and I won't go through the whole thing, but it says, Her Majesty the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, having been compelled to take up in arms in support of an ally. It mentions Britain, it mentions Ireland, but it doesn't mention Berwick. And similarly, the Treaty of Paris, this mentions, it says Austria, France, Great Britain, Russia, Sardinia, and Turkey, but it doesn't mention Berwick. There's no mention of Berwick on either of those things. So the whole thing, as I said, is just apocryphal and completely wrong. However, it has had some interesting consequences. Now, adding to the local law, this is from Nina Strochlich's article, adding to the local law is a tale that in the 1960s, a Soviet official came to visit Berwick and finally signed the long-forgotten peace treaty that ended 100 years of war. Then Mayor Robert Knox was said to declare, "Tell the Russians they can sleep easy in their beds." According to a town historian, this account has been repeated by Berwick's older residents, but couldn't be corroborated by a written record from the time. I think this is the town historian that she was consulting for her article, so that was important to give credit to Jim Herbert there. But the thing is, if you look at Berwick's Wikipedia entry, what occurred to me was, looking at this, it's got a paragraph, relations with Russia. There is an apocryphal story that Berwick is, or recently was, technically at war with Russia. According to a story by George Hawthorne in The Guardian of 28th of December 1966, the London correspondent of Pravda visited the mayor of Berwick, Councillor Robert Knox, and the two made a mutual declaration of peace. Knox said, here we go again, "Please tell the Russian people through your newspaper that they can sleep peacefully in their beds." The same story, cited to the Associated Press, appeared in the Baltimore Sun of the 17th of December 66, Washington Post, and the Christian Science Monitor. So the thing was, I realised that this is a London correspondent of Pravda. There must therefore have been an article in Pravda. That's where this came from. That's where the Associated Press got the story from, and then the other newspapers picked it up from there. So I managed to track this down. This is A Forgotten War by Pravda's London correspondent, Oleg Orestov. So in 2015, I wrote an article for The Advertiser, and here it is, Recalling an Unlikely and Forgotten Peace. It's got there, Berwick was famously still at war with Russia after it was admitted from the peace treaty that ended the Crimean War. Now, this is something which I just added today. a very dear friend, Bob Bradley, who died earlier this month. And I've included this because I only put this into the article because of knowing him. It's right at the beginning, and I'll just read it. On November the 28th, 1966, according to that week's edition of the Berwick Advertiser, Tweedmouth Bowling Club's Monday evening whist drive went ahead as usual. Negotiations with Hereford United to bring goalkeeping player-manager Jock Wallace to Sheffield Park were in their final stages. 2 days later, on St Andrew's Day, he signed on the dotted line. Elsewhere, having recently been sprung from his cell in Wormwood Scrubs, convicted Soviet mole George Blake had gone to ground in London. Soon afterwards, he resurfaced on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Now, the reason I have put this in is that Bob actually knew George Blake. He knew him when he was studying Arabic at the British Army Language School near Beirut in the late 50s or early 60s. And occasionally Blake used to give him and his friends lifts into town from this, what was called by the locals a spy school, not surprisingly. So, because Bob taught Arabic in the British Army. And not only that, but Bob noticed that Blake spoke with a slightly foreign accent. He's Dutch. And sharing a pigeonhole with George Blake, he told how he once flicked through George Blake's passport. I just think that's quite extraordinary. So this was a suspected Soviet mole, and there was Bob flicking through his passport. So he also had Kim Philby pointed out to him at a gentleman's club in Beirut. So that was a bit of a nest of spies, Beirut, in the late 50s and early 60s. And incidentally, his Requiem Mass is at Our Lady in St Cuthbert's at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. So I just thought I'd mention that. Now, so this is another part of the article. The old chestnut about Berwick's belligerent stance towards Russia is summarized as follows. This is from the Russian article, from the Soviet Pravda article. Over the centuries, Berwick changed hands 13 times. The Scots drove out the English and captured the town. Then the English knights defeated the warriors in checked skirts. In 1482, the town was finally included among English possessions. But although the English were now masters of the Scottish municipality, their consciences were not altogether untroubled. The town with 12,000 inhabitants was given special privileges. Thus, at the coronation of a new monarch, the mayor of Berwick is third after the mayors of London and York. In the past, official government declarations mentioned Berwick alongside constituent parts of Britain such as Scotland and Wales. And so in the last century, that's the 19th century, when the Crimean War broke out, England's declaration of war against Tsarist Russia was signed by Victoria, Queen of Great Britain, Ireland, Berwick-upon-Tweed, and the British dominions beyond the seas. In 1856, the Treaty of Paris was signed, but it forgot to mention Berwick-upon-Tweed, and so it remained in a state of war with Russia. So this was the version of events that Russians got. And actually, it wasn't Arestov's fault that he came up looking for this story. It was journalists in London. They're the ones who put him onto it and put him up to it and told him that Berwick was still in a state of war. So that was the article, and this is how it appeared in online. You can actually still find it online, recalling an unlikely and forgotten piece, and that's me. And that obviously is a slightly how did I put it? Slightly dodgy picture of somebody with a kilt, but not as dodgy. At least that is a kilt. Whereas this, on the other hand, is a skirt. The reason I say that is because these are England football fans. These are wearing this was in Russia in the summer in June. I took this photo of an English football fan wearing a skirt. He obviously thinks he's wearing a kilt, but he's obviously wearing a skirt. How can anyone wear an England football shirt and a kilt? You can't. Obviously, it's a skirt. So, right. Anyway, so the 1966 peace treaty. The Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, and the Guardian, among others, published their own versions of the story in December of the same year, having apparently picked up the gist of it from the Associated Press. This must have been how the legend of a Soviet official who signed a peace treaty with Councillor Robert Knox, Berwick's then mayor, was born. Councillor Knox's well-known quote was, "Please tell the Russian people through your newspaper that they can sleep peacefully in their beds." It is filled out in the original Pravda piece with the following: "We respect Russian people and we wish to make friends with them. And so we are doing. Soviet ships carrying timber often come to the port of Berwick. Your sailors are always welcome guests in our town. May this history be left as a casus belli, a reason for war at which we can only laugh." There was another point I made about in the article. I won't dwell on it, but I think there was an atmosphere of goodwill between Britain and Russia in 1966, because England won the World Cup, and it was with the help from a Russian linesman, famously. Although he wasn't Russian, he was from Azerbaijan. But the Russian linesman who awarded one of Jeff Hurst's goals in the final, that cannot but have helped relations between Britain and, England rather, specifically England and Russia in 1966. So it was a nice article, and another passage repaying a bit of careful scrutiny provides details of a conversation with one of the town's older residents, Peter Patterson. "When World War II started, I was a sailor in the Merchant Navy. For 12 months, I sailed with the Northern convoys delivering military supplies to the USSR. Towards the end of 1942, Nazi torpedo boats attacked our convoy, and I was wounded. I spent 5 weeks in Murmansk, receiving treatment in the hospital from a woman doctor. The city was bombed, but the Russian people never lost their optimism. I will never forget those days spent among good Soviet citizens. As for the misunderstanding about the belligerent town of Berwick, then I can only laugh with you." So this was, actually those convoys are taken very seriously in Russia. And this was UK's Princess Anne pays tribute to Arctic convoys in Arkhangelsk. And I've included that because this was the 1st of September 2016. There have been improving relations between Britain and Russia since the Crimea was absorbed into Russia again in 2014. And so, for instance, the daughter of the Queen has attended an event like this to mark an important anniversary. And another thing that happened was, let me see, where are we? The Daily Express reported just a couple of weeks ago on Prince Michael of Kent's visit to Russia to open the Brooks Moscow School last month. Since the 19th of September 2018, Prince Michael undertook secret mission to Russia at peak of tensions. He discreetly visited the Russian capital at the height of tensions with the Kremlin this month. Now, the thing is, so you've got Prince Michael of Kent, and he's often said to look very similar to his relative Tsar Nicholas II. Effectively, by going to Moscow, he decided to ignore the goings-on in Salisbury, which, for the purposes of this talk, is also what I intend to do. So let's not go there, basically. I'm not going to go to Salisbury, but that is another... Well, anyway, so that's that. I'll just leave that there for now. So to say that there are people who are not paying attention to what is going on in Salisbury at all. Now, from the New Zealand daily, The Colonist, the 8th of April 1914, and so this is with further acknowledgements to Nina Strochlitsch's February 2015 article in the Daily Beast. This is helping to explain how this happened, why we got to this idea that Berwick is at war. A well-known economist, Archdeacon Cunningham, has just discovered that the town of Berwick has been at war with the Empire of Russia for nearly 60 years, writes a London correspondent. It seems that on the outbreak of the Crimean War, Berwick, under some old custom, declared war independently of the United Kingdom. Yet, when Russia came to make her peace with France, England, and Turkey, she forgot to negotiate with Berwick, and the city on the Tweed has never formally concluded peace. Archdeacon Cunningham suggests that this may be a reason for the Russian fleet under Admiral Rozhdestvensky firing on the British trawlers on the Dogger Bank. This was a curious episode. It happened 10 years before this, and where are we? It was that they fired on British fishing boats, thinking they were part of the Japanese Navy. They were at war with Japan, and they were completely the wrong end of the Eurasian landmass. But anyway, they thought that they were Japanese spy boats or something. So anyway, they fired on them, and Archdeacon Cunningham has found come up with this idea that Berwick is at war with Russia. Now the thing is that here's Archdeacon William Cunningham, and you can see that I've messed about a bit with the normal Wikipedia formats, but that is just his Wikipedia entry, and he was a very distinguished economic historian. But what I think is important to note about his mistake that he's made here is that this is the actual newspaper from New Zealand, the Colonist. It took place published on April the 8th, 1914. So this is in the midst of wars and rumours of war. The European continent is actually about to go into an appalling war. So there were rumours of war in the early months of 1914, and that's why we have ended up with this situation. That in fact a rumour has taken root and has continued to circulate, at the risk of mixing a metaphor there, but anyway, it's continued to circulate well over 100 years later. So now the thing is, what I've decided to do here, this is, I came across this map when I was just in Russia, and a humorous German map, 1914. This could be a good subject for a talk on its own. It's just after the outbreak of World War I, and this is another one. This is relevant to the Crimean War, the comic map of the seat of war, 1854, and you can see the Russian Empire there. And in fact, you can't see, but I'll just bring up a detail. The Russian bear has written on him despotism, ignorance, falsehood, treachery, bigotry, cruelty, slavery, other things like that. So in a way, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. We get the same kind of message about Russia nowadays. But anyway, incidentally, I don't know if teddy bears had actually been invented at that time, but it seems to me that an absent-minded onlooker might almost have got an idea from this, that bears could make excellent cuddly toys. But anyway, this is supposed to be the enemy, and this is the map at the end of the Crimean War, the treaty map. So you can see Russia has got a bloody paw as a result of the war, and a slightly more menacing figure of a bear, which lurks behind the teddy bear there. So anyway, but this idea of a satirical map was taken up again by Germany, and so here we are again with this one. And the detail which I'd like to show you here, this is a little bit sort of tenuous, but anyway, you have to just humour me really. But this is the detail of Britain. And what you can see there, so the North Sea. Actually, in those days, it was often called the German Sea. Up until the First World War, it was called the German Sea. But now, of course, it's the North Sea. Now, the thing is, what you've got there is an iron fist and a submarine. And I know this is really, the submarine being there, this is really equally absurd. But I'd like to suggest that it's more appropriate to say that it was Germany rather than Russia, which at one time was at war with Berwick, or at least Berwickshire, because of the HMS Pathfinder. So I think that this is in the early part of World War I, is a reference to the fate of HMS Pathfinder, which was sunk off St Abb's Head on the 5th of September 1914. And what it says at the bottom there, HMS Pathfinder sunk by a German mine, September the 5th, 1914. But many of you will know that that's not actually what happened at all. It was the first, where are we? This was the first ship to fall victim to a motorized torpedo launched from a submarine on the 5th of September 1914. There were only 19 survivors, estimated 260 lives were lost. And one other point I'd like to make here is that this shows that the British government sometimes adopts an official line, especially in matters of war and peace, which can be at variance with the truth. Obviously that's not very controversial, but it does happen. And I hope to come back to this theme of the German rather than Russian menace, without, wanting to open old wounds or anything. But anyway, so this then is an article which appeared, I only just discovered this in September. The Berwick Advertiser, 3rd of May 1979, Russians come in friendship. But the thing is, I haven't got time to talk about it. What happened was, I wrote an article which I hoped the Advertiser might include, and they, for whatever reason, maybe I didn't get it to them in time, but there are copies of an article about this. If anyone's interested, they can read about it. And so to give you an idea of why I think it should be interesting, this is a picture of, there are 3 Russian newsmen, journalists, who came to Berwick in April, in fact, 1979. And one of them is called Mr. Yuri Kobaladze. And it says there he's a Soviet TV and radio correspondent. But the thing is, he wasn't. Well, he was a Soviet TV and radio correspondent, but he was also a KGB intelligence officer. So, and he's now a sort of media personality in Russia, and you can see him there. In fact, he was interviewed here, and he was talking about the fact that he thinks there is now another Cold War, as it happens. But I haven't got time to go into that. But if you're interested, there's articles at the back, and you're very welcome to take one away. So the thing is, speaking of media personalities, these people have caused problems as far as this story is concerned. These people have actually helped to popularize or reinforce this myth. Stephen Fry and Friends, this BBC television series QI, quite interesting. One of the things it says here, points are deducted for answers which merely repeat common misconceptions and urban myth. And yet this is a very major part of one of these episodes which deals with Berwick, and it just confirms this. It puts emphasis on this myth. So this was the one, and in fact it was the one that's used by the BBC. This was the actual episode, the 4th of November 2005, and I think this is why in 2006, it seems to me logical that in 2006 there was a weekend of Berwick at war with Russia, and it may well have been partly because of this episode of QI. So what happened was, hold on, jumping the gun there slightly. What happened was, Stephen Fry, introducing the theme, he says, Sevastopol and Balaclava and the charge of the Light Brigade, it's that war, yes. But he omits any mention of Florence Nightingale, which he should have done. He should definitely have talked about Florence Nightingale. And this is actually from Berwick's Museum in the barracks. Florence Nightingale, a gentlewoman with nursing experience, administrative genius, and an iron will, arrived at Scutari in November 1855 with 38 volunteer nurses. She reorganized the hospital administration and brought cleanliness, comfort, and good nursing to the sick. Florence Nightingale became a national heroine and the Army's rather resented advisor on medical and sanitary problems. So anyway, that's right. It's a very blokey program, QI, and they should have mentioned Florence Nightingale. But then he came out with an absolute howler. What he said here was, responding to a comment from Jeremy Clarkson, and we got their cannons and made the VC out of them. Stephen Fry came out with this howler. It was around the time that the cannon was being invented. It was around the 1850s, 1854. What? That's about 400 years out, at least 400 years out. Hopeless. Anyway, so, but on the subject of VCs, I happened to notice this is Alnwick Castle, and General Lord Henry Percy VC from Alnwick Castle. This is on the wall there. Commemorating his Victoria Cross that he got. And then obviously this brings up the subject of Berwick's cannon, which is very important. So a trophy from the Crimean War. This could be the grain of truth in the story about Berwick's war with Russia. Now, the thing is, as well though, on the subject of Victoria Crosses, although there is an ongoing demand for these medals, I've been assured by Derek Sharman that Berwick's cannon is not threatened, as it's made of iron rather than bronze. However, the other thing I'd like to say about these guns is that if one absolutely has to use them to make medals, it would be much more appropriate to make George rather than Victoria Crosses, since Russia's coat of arms, and that's what you can see there, that is actually Berwick's cannon. Some of you will have noticed that Russia's coat of arms is on there. But Russia's coat of arms incorporates St. George slaying the dragon. The other thing you can see there, that's Russia's current football shirt. So you can see in the centre St. George slaying the dragon. So if there are to be medals made out of these cannons, I would suggest that the George Cross is much more appropriate than the Victoria Cross. But be that as it may, it's very helpful to us that Linda Bankier looked into the history of the Russian gun. And so this is an excerpt from something that she wrote a few years ago. Recently I was asked whether the gun on the ramparts was connected with the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. And it reminded me of some research I undertook a couple of years ago for a youth theatre production I worked on with Wendy Payne. How did the town acquire the gun and how was it received? The following extracts from the Berwick Advertiser help tell the story. The Berwick Advertiser from the 15th of May 1858. Crimean Trophy. Captain Gordon, who has endeavoured, but without success, to prevail on his friends now in power, to withdraw their condemnatory edict against the barracks here, has had offered to him by way of a peace offering to the people of Berwick one of the cannon captured in the course of the Crimean campaign. The government, however, make the present conditional, namely, that the receivers of the gift should pay for the carriage on which the piece of ordnance is to stand. As this payment amounts to something like £16, perhaps the difficulty of raising the money may prevent the gift being accepted. However, as Linda found out, the money was raised, and that's how Berwick came to be in possession of the gun. And then there's one more of these articles that she found, which is just for curiosity and interest. We regret to mention that on Tuesday morning last we observed that some evil-disposed person or persons had obliterated a portion of the newly painted appropriate inscription on our trophy of the Crimean War. We hope this act was only the work of some midnight prowler, prompted by wanton mischief. But as the only portion of the inscription defaced is the name of the respected man for whose minority the trophy was received, it is to be feared that it is the act of some person who cherishes a mean and malevolent spirit towards the gentleman. Whichever is the case, we hope the police authorities may succeed in bringing the perpetrators of such a public outrage to how do you pronounce that? Condign, that's it. Condign punishment. Thus, holding up such detestable conduct to public opprobrium. Now, the thing is, so that, whoops, here we go, oh dear, I'm ahead of myself. Right. That was 14th of September 1861. In 1862, the Russians unveiled this monument. This is the monument of the Russian millennium, and it's in Veliki Novgorod, Great Novgorod in northern Russia. Importantly, again, this is another thing that you could have a whole series of talks on just for this one thing. But one important thing to mention about it, Ivan the Terrible actually doesn't feature on this monument. So you've got people like Peter the Great, Alexander Nevsky, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, Princess Olga, who is people who are very, very important in the history of Russia. But Ivan the Terrible isn't on there. And Novgorod has a sort of a relatively democratic tradition. And the reason Ivan the Terrible was omitted is that that during his reign, his secret police, who are called the Oprichnina, they were responsible for a terrible massacre of Novgorod citizens. So the people of Novgorod remembered that, and they weren't going to have Ivan the Terrible on this monument. So it's one of those. It's an important thing for Russia's relations with Europe, and sort of aligning Russian politics more with a European outlook than perhaps a slightly stereotyped authoritarianism that is associated with Russia. This is an important monument from that point of view. And behind is Saint Sophia's very impressive cathedral. That's within the Kremlin in Veliki Novgorod. So the thing was, though, I took this photograph exactly a week ago, and it wasn't the only place I visited. Now, this is where we need to maybe have a VAR. Perhaps I ought to be brought to condign punishment. That's holding up such detestable conduct and public opprobrium, because I didn't just go to Novgorod. The thing was that the World Cup was a great success. These are English fans in Kaliningrad, where I was. And you can see they're having a great time. And the atmosphere was really extraordinary. This was a photograph I took, which didn't come out particularly well, but this is much more impressive from the internet. Again, this is in Kaliningrad. So they took an electricity pylon and they turned it into the mascot for the World Cup, which I thought that's a great idea. So then this was a scene in the center of Kaliningrad, which is not very remarkable, but it's where football fans went to see games which they didn't have tickets for. But in the background, the reason I've included it is that this building here is actually a synagogue. So they're rebuilding a synagogue, and that again is something that is perhaps an interesting development to see in modern Russia. So everything, it was a great atmosphere. And I was then, Russia's parliament, the Duma, after this World Cup, which went so well, they voted to extend visa-free travel conditions for World Cup ticket holders until the end of the year. And I was invited to go over for my birthday by some friends. So this is it didn't come out brilliantly well, but that's me on my birthday, which was at the end of last month, and with a replica of the World Cup, which is a story, I won't go into that, but anyway. So these are some friends, and I was given, while I was there in Russia, I was given this extraordinary gift, which is a bullet from the Crimean War. So a friend of friends, had a few of these and had a spare one and wanted to give me a bullet. What I didn't do, I didn't bring it home, because there is a law against bringing antiquities out of Russia. And although Andrei, who gave it to me, he'd be livid actually if he knew that I didn't bring it home, because he told me how I could do it, and you know the way I could put it in my wallet, but anyway, but I didn't want to try to cheat the people. Actually, I could mention when I came out of Russia, from Novgorod, I noticed for the first time, I think probably it's not very surprising, there's nothing very unusual about it, but I noticed for the first time that the woman who I was speaking to, who was checking my passport, she had a badge on her breast saying that she was from the FSB, so that's the successor of the KGB. And anyway, I just didn't want to. I didn't want to try to cheat them. And so anyway, that's a bullet from the Crimean War.
Where is this bullet now?
It's in Kaliningrad. I left it with friends. I left it with friends of this friend who gave it to me. Yeah. And I also then, when I was there, took this photograph. This is a very small town, more like a village, near Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad, incidentally, I won't go into that, but it's the former German part of Russia. It used to be Germany. It used to be Königsberg. And these towns and villages used to be German towns, or Prussian, rather, Prussian. So this is quite an attractive place with a windmill. And there's a church there, which is very beautiful. You can only see the top of it, but that's a very beautiful new church. But what I particularly wanted to draw your attention to is this. Yeah. Because this is just very ironic.
Yes.
This says clothes from Europe, and they've used the British flag. So I just thought that was quite an extraordinary thing to add. Anyway, but the thing was, I keep saying that, so the thing was. Anyway, but this is why it was a little bit controversial. What I did after being in Kaliningrad, this is where we need to go back to VAR. I visited the Crimea after that. I went to the Crimea. You see, the Crimea now has a bridge which crosses from here to here. And I decided that with this talk coming up, and with the opportunity I had of travelling without a visa, I would visit the Crimea. So I did so. A map of the Crimea and plan of Sebastopol. And this again is from the museum here in Berwick. So this is, I just took this photograph because it's the only thing that mentions balaclava, and this is a word that sort of summons up the idea of the Crimean War. Balaclava, but Yalta and Simferopol are two other major places, and I stayed in Yalta. So I stayed in Yalta with this family who are friends of friends again. So they had lived in Kaliningrad previously, and on the left is Rita, that's short for Margarita, Victor, their grandson Sergei, and that's me. And I had come down with a bit of a cold. I was going to mention here, I came down with a cold, and there's an important Russian saying: if you treat a cold, it will clear up in a week. If you don't treat it, it will clear up in 7 days. So that's a very important Russian saying. Anyway, this was then also, I gave a copy of the Berwick Advertiser with my article to Rita, and we weren't able to organise a meeting in the time available, but she hoped to show it to an English-speaking friend of hers who is the editor of a local magazine, so it may come to that person's attention. So that's my article, which I had a spare copy, and we were outside, incidentally, as well, the Roman Catholic Church in Yalta. So while I was there, I also had an opportunity to visit a museum. It's a panorama. I've never really seen one of these in Britain, I don't think, but it's you go into this sort of tower, and there's a very impressive panorama all the way around, which you follow around on a sort of balcony, and you can see things with the Crimean War. So this is a Soviet-era painting, but it shows, for instance, here a Russian Florence Nightingale person, and there's a couple of cannons. And unfortunately, I can't go into very much detail because of time. But at this stage, I'd like to get a little bit political. The thing is, I was just thinking about this. Politics, you can't really. History is going to have politics in it. You can't take the political egg out of the omelette of history, can you really? So anyway, but this is going to be a bit political. This is the reason why people criticize Russia for what they did in Crimea. The Budapest Memorandum. So the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. According to the memorandum, Russia, the US, and the UK confirmed that they would respect Belarusian, Kazakh, and Ukrainian independence and sovereignty and the existing borders. The other things are not. So that's the main thing. Respecting Belarusian, Kazakh, and Ukrainian independence and sovereignty within the existing borders. Now, this is Lenin. You do see statues of Lenin in many parts of Russia. There are certainly lots of them in the Crimea. And you don't see them anymore in Ukraine. They've all been taken down. And you don't see them in other parts of the Soviet bloc. But you do still see them in Russia. The thing about Lenin, though, I'm certainly not a fan of his. Oh, okay. So Lenin, this is in a place called Pragnitz, a very small town near Kaliningrad, named after Pravda, actually. It's actually named after the newspaper. And so this is a question that I was reminded of this idea when I was in the Crimea by my hosts. It's quite a popular idea, and in fact, it's not just an idea. For some people, it's an accepted fact, and I would say that that's reasonable. Was Lenin a German agent? In a sense, there was nothing particularly. So this is the New York Times. In a sense, there was nothing particularly new about a German plot to undermine an enemy in wartime, an enemy government in wartime. For centuries, great powers have played this game. During the Napoleonic Wars, France aided Irish rebels to undermine Britain and Polish nationalists against Russia. Britain, in turn, backed Spanish guerrillas fighting French occupation forces. The Germans, though late comers to the arena, were quick learners after Germany's unification in 1871. They even coined a word for this specific type of influence operation, Revolutionsierungspolitik, or the policy of revolutionizing. Now this is from the Wikipedia entry of the former world heavyweight boxing champion Vitaly Klitschko, mayor of Kiev since June 2014. Klitschko became leader of the political party Ukrainian Democratic Alliance, or Reform, UDAR. That means punch or blow in Russian. So this is the understanding of UDAR in Russian. In April 2010. During the 2010 Ukrainian local elections, the party won representatives in Ukrainian municipalities and oblast councils and the parliament. This is the important bit. Klitschko and UDAR became a partner of the Christian Democratic Union of Germany in November 2011. UDAR is supported by the German government and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and received support in particular from Angela Merkel and also politicians from the Conservative European People's Party. According to information gained by the German magazine Der Spiegel, the target was to set up Klitschko purposefully as a new strongman in Kiev in order to counter the Kremlin's growing influence. Support consisted in logistics, training, and joint performances. Assistance was also promised by Christopher Heusgen, former German UN ambassador since July 2017, Angela Merkel's most important foreign policy advisor, Ronald Pofalla, Chief of Staff of the German Chancellery, Federal Minister for Special Affairs from 2009 to 2013, and Guido Westerwelle, formerly German Foreign Minister. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the German government have actually set up Klitschko purposefully, as they say here, purposefully as a new strongman in Kiev in order to counter this way the Kremlin's growing influence. So they are interfering in Ukrainian domestic politics. They are not respecting Ukrainian sovereignty. Germany obviously has immense economic power compared to Ukraine, and they can use that to influence internal Ukrainian politics. And the Germans were not by any stretch of the imagination the only people who were doing that in late 2013 and early 2014. So I know that you're free to disagree with this, of course, but the point is, the first point here, respect for Belarusian, Kazakh and Ukrainian independence and sovereignty and existing borders doesn't only mean in terms of not slicing off chunks of their territory. It means respecting their internal democratic processes, because the leader of Ukraine was democratically elected, and that was an election that was observed by the European Union and given a kingdom of health. As I say, this isn't necessarily something you'll necessarily agree with, but there is a Russian point of view. This is what I'm trying to give you an opportunity to see the Russian point of view. That they see, the way they see it was that Ukrainian internal politics was interfered with by the Germans, by the Americans, by the British, probably less so the EU, and therefore there was a revolution. It brought down a democratically elected government, and they couldn't accept that in fact Sebastopol would be taken away from them. They couldn't accept that their naval port in Sebastopol would become a NATO port. They simply couldn't accept it, and that's why they took control of the Crimea. So that was the point I was going to make there. And then this is the last slide. This is the Russian goalkeeper Igor Akinfeev, and he's trying to save a penalty from Luka Modric. If he had managed to save that penalty, Russia would have actually played England in the semi-final of the World Cup, and it would. Who knows how on earth that game could have happened? I don't know. I was thinking about it. Would I support England? Of course I would. I would have supported England, but it was with all of the politics and things swirling around. It would have been quite an extraordinary thing to behold. But anyway, that's how close it was, because the ball there, it hits the bar and then it bounces across, and it only just doesn't go in. I mean, it was literally centimetres away from going in. If it had gone in, then England would have played Russia in the semi-final of the World Cup, and that would have been a great game anyway. That was a great game. So I think that's more or less the end of the talk.
Student. Were you a student of Russian?
Yeah, I studied Russian. That's right.
Where?
In St Andrews.
So did she.
Right. Yeah, I was in Bradford, and we were very red in the late 60s when I went out. We had a red vice chancellor, and Howard was our chancellor. And we had all sorts of interesting lecturers who came to the book and then disappeared without notice. And I must look into that, because it's all a bit mysterious.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was.
A lot of mysterious things do happen.
To do with Russian.
Well, they do, I suppose.
Russian.
Yeah. But at the same time, there's a lot of emphasis on things like the KGB and spies and stuff, which, in a way, it's inevitable. But at the same time, it's not. It's not altogether healthy. Having said that, I must admit the article that if anyone's interested in the back is about a KGB officer against Berwick. But yeah, well, I hope you might have success with the internet. You might be able to find some of those people. You might be able to track down what happened.
Yeah, I've tried. I've got to go back to to a university I think was there and see people
So,
I was just ruminating about at my university when I studied Russian in the late 60s, there were a lot of Russian lecturers who actually learned Russian at that same school where you said that chap had been teaching the spy school, yeah. The spy
Oh, in
school.
Beirut.
the Beirut.
Yeah.
Right.
And some of these lecturers were at the university for a little while, and then they just, all of a sudden, they weren't there. I don't know. It wasn't that they were affected, but I'm sure there were a few double agents at our university at the time, because it was the vice chancellor was a very left-wing chap, and Harold Wilson was our chancellor, so it was a very sort of left environment, and it was odd, but very interesting. Something to go. Yeah. The story is fascinating about art, being at war and not being at war, because it's a great PR achievement having this story circulating over so many years about Berwick and Rock.
I suppose so, but I suppose if it wasn't that, it would be something else. I think that in London they like to put a sort of tag on particular places, don't they? If it wasn't that, it would be something else, I expect. Still, yeah, in a way, it certainly has some interesting consequences, actually.
I wonder how it can
As a Berwicker, that's one of our best stories to tell tourists.
Yeah.
Oh, it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
And tourists love that story. But,
Yeah.
you can see this will go vampire next, you know.
And it does help to stick, like Somerset has King Arthur, or what have you, and Berwick has a few urban myths too, or legends.
Right. Well, absolutely. Yeah.
Very great imagination.
Yeah, I saw that, and I saw that it was reproduced with permission, and I didn't have permission to reproduce it. But yeah, yeah, that's a nice cartoon. It's just it's a little Berwick bear being completely daunted by a great big Russian bear. So yeah.
What do you think about English Heritage's claim that they actually own the cannon and it doesn't belong to Berwick?
Well, that doesn't sound very. Presumably they need to be referred to Linda Bankier's article. I think.
No, when I was, it was taken away to be painted early on this year, and there was an article in advertising that said the English Heritage had taken the cannon away to paint their cannon, and they sent it to Wales to get painted. Obviously there's nobody enough around here to do it. And when I was in the dentist's, there was a copy of English Heritage's magazine, and there was an article about various cannon that own, and they're very proud of the cannon at Berwick because it's the only Russian cannon that is owned by English Heritage.
That isn't.
They've claimed ownership of it.
Oh, right. Well, it seems to me that because the people of Berwick came up with the put up funds for the carriage, that if you look at the actual the sequence of events that happened, that it ought to be regarded as a gift that belongs to Berwick.
But according to English Heritage, they're going to leave it where it is just now unless it deteriorates, and then they'll take it away.
Okay, so yeah, but there probably should be. I would suggest certainly there should be a fuss kicked up if they did take it away.
Oh yeah, we'd have to.
Well,
That would be
perhaps we should have the
tourist
fuss
PR.
before the crisis.
Maybe. So,
Yeah, and get the local media and then the national media and Stephen Fry.
if they threaten to take it away in any way, then there should be a fuss, because that's an important part of Berwick's heritage, I suppose.
Get the Russians in, you know.
Well, the Russians could clearly come in to mediate.
I don't know how to get the media who came in 1979.
Oh yeah, get him to come.
Come
Yeah,
back.
absolutely. Why not? Yeah.
This could run.
Probably Djokovic was, yeah, he'd be delighted. He enjoyed his time in Britain, you know that. So, any other questions?